thank you everyone for coming to the last Digital Humanities Hangout of this term. Today we are delighted to welcome Dr. James Butler, who is a digital and spatial humanities researcher here at Lancaster University. He specialises in place name records and is particularly focused on tracking and integrating variant, historic or alternate forms. He has recently focused on creatively visualising records to place their etymological placement and development within broader sociocultural contexts. An interest in mapping literary settings through spatial roles that connect name, depiction and emotional association has guided his research since starting his postgraduate studies, for which this talk will explore his most recent steps, directly informed by his most recent research project. Take it away.
Thank you, Catherine. And that start of the postgraduate studies was a lot longer ago than I care to admit these days. Anyway, hi everyone. Thank you for taking the time to attend my talk this afternoon. So I'm really pleased to have the chance to discuss my latest personal research, which is focused on finding a new path for the digital development of literary onomastic studies. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, onomastics is a study of names, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, and it can cover quite a wide remit that is highly contextualised with geo-socio-political linguistics, and I think it's fair to say is built around examining larger scale patterns to identify broader developmental trends, i.e. the use of bigger picture data to clarify the focal and developmental priorities as to most likely inferences, which is when it comes to the real world is derived typically from physical characteristics that directly correspond with the ground, or that which can be mapped. Topography and visual characteristics. These two aspects dominate the etymological meanings that underpin the vast majority of place names as we understand them and engage with them, even if those aspects are unrecognisable to our modern eyes. So in short, every name had a meaning that could, or has a meaning that could be discerned by the early traveller as what you saw was what you got, literally. There's a huge range of work constantly undertaken on the historic and cultural analysis of names, be it personal or place, but interest in literary sources has always been minimal in comparison to real-world entities. The quote by Paul Cavell summarises the nature of the problem as I see it with the field rather succinctly. Such work necessarily focuses on isolates, single texts or a series linked by a common author, and typically focus on personal names, as their cryptilic creativity and significance is much more easily managed and weavable into a narrative. Where studies do examine the topographical namescape, the focus is typically on created names and their significance to the plot, the cryptilic portion of the personal names, or characters. And while such investigations are valuable in highlighting the range of semantic inventiveness that underpins meaningful name creation, I've conducted several such studies myself, but such a focus on the naming process of limited selections of named entities in a work, basing discussion around the most interesting, distinctive or unique elements of a text namescape, unfortunately presents severely incomplete pictures of spatial interaction, engagement, and functionality. This statement by Cavell is building on arguments made more than 40 years previously, and very little has changed since. And names that are employed as literary devices, names that are employed as literary devices are inherently entirely qualitative in their basis, which kind of doubles down the highly individual nature of such studies. Whereas the other extreme of working with a complete set of identified names taken from a text, without any context other than order of appearance, presents its own major interpretational issues. It's neither one thing nor the other. Work with literary resources has regrettably fallen between these two states with little consistency, as different texts have required radically different approaches to fully explore the relevance of names in each specific narrative. My method, which I'm sharing with you today, I think offers an ideal middle ground that allows a critical reinterpretation of spatial depiction from a core qualitatively established basis. I truly believe this approach has the potential to completely reinvent the analytic component for the field. And now this is a big and very bold claim, I know, but hopefully this presentation will convince you all as well. But first, to the heart of the matter. Next slide, please. Thank you. Literary texts are necessarily self-contained and individually contextualized slices of an incomplete world, where only a relatively small number of places are engaged with. They are purposefully crafted to include only those elements pertinent to either the narrative, character, or author, and so the point of view provided is intentionally limited in the amount of explicit spatial information provided. Consequently, the traditional approach has compensated by shifting its focus to the more semantic level. How do these specific names relate to the narrative, and what subtle nuances do their appearance add? This is very specific and very individually tailored. The spatialization of Shakespeare's works are very different from those encountered in a Sherlock Holmes text. There's no two ways about it. Or is there? Now there's a nice little hook to keep you all engaged. Anyway, I would argue that critical engagement with literary namescapes should be conducted with data derived from the text alone, as opposed to a more top-down approach of traditional mapping techniques. Working with this sort of data has to be bottom-up, building the spatial knowledge iteratively as it is portraying it, working with it as it is experienced by the reader. And with regards to the term namescape as used in my title, as you can probably guess, it is a portmanteau of names and landscape. It's essentially the data set of all identified names within a specified context. And now just a little bit more background to establish where this work has come from. Next slide, please. Thank you. I was the Linguistics and Coding RA on the Chronotopic Cartographies project here at Lancaster, as Catherine mentioned in her introduction, along with Professor Sally Bushell and Doctors Rebecca Hutchin and Duncan Hay, which concluded last April. We were funded by the AHRC to explore the viability of creating an alternate, useful form of mapping fictional spatiality. This was entirely exploratory, which afforded us a fantastic degree of freedom to experiment, tinker, and tweak and play about with several ideas. I could talk for the full hour on this, but in brief, after many trials and experiments, we developed an approach that represented discrete spaces as experienced in a text and mapped them in an abstract manner through how they related, how these spaces connected to one another, rather than working to a fixed concrete model. Sorry, my cat seems to have opened the door. Go on. Always typical. Next slide, please, Catherine. Thank you. This was in stark contrast to the many literary mapping platforms that have come before, such as the Literary Atlas of Europe, Litlong, the Literary Atlas of Wales, to name just a few. And although I hasten to add that I absolutely enjoy the connecting of fictional experiences to real place, such literary touristic approaches tend to be little more than shaped summaries of a narrative, or the provision of additional contextualizing information external to that which is presented within the text. Yes, you can plot on a map roughly where an event may have taken place, and you can give some details about that place in 1819 as 1950, which may have some relevance or be of some interest or some note, but unless it's taken directly from the text, I don't think that that's very useful when working with a namescape. For wider critical work, very possibly the semantic side of things, yes, why not, by all means. But when working with the spatiality, I don't think that's necessary. Anyway, I take issue with two critical points that emerge from trying to shoehorn literary datasets into conventional real-world topographic maps, as these projects have a reliance on GIS mapping. The first of these issues is that all the named spaces in a text can be mapped to a real-world equivalence. And the second, that every name serves in equal capacity within the text. Neither of these is true, and more on this momentarily. Next slide, please. Thank you. But on the project, we adopted the idea of the Bakhtinian chronotope, where textual representations of space are categorized according to the sense, emotion, and feeling of time that is experienced at that point. On the slide is a very brief overview of the. Sorry, can you move to the next slide, please? Oh, there's a slide missing. Can you go back, please? Thank you. That's it. Well, there should be a table of 12 distinct chronotopes that we used, and these were very broad in their delineation. And just to provide a quick example, the castle form wouldn't just be applied to literal castles denoted as such in a text. So there wouldn't have to be a castle per se, but a castle space would be any space in which the reader experiences a sense that corresponded with the ideas of confinement, imprisonment, stasis, discomfort, and darkness, visible traces of the past, lack of progression, that sort of things. Aspects that are nicely taggable, by the by. But by enriching distinct spaces with this information, what sort of chronotopic space was it? We were able to create maps of literary form. It did not matter whether these spaces, whether these settings were real, whether they were inspired by somewhere, whether they were entirely fictional, but rather which senses dominated and how spaces changed their chronotopic form throughout a narrative, given contextual frames, and, most importantly, how the narratives transition between them. That was how we mapped these spaces. One intent of identifying these discrete characteristics was to establish the ground principles for developing a more automated tool set. I made a solid start on this with co-I and long-term collaborator David Bevan of the Turing Institute, but alas, this was in January and February 2020, just as pandemic craziness began. And although the markup was manually undertaken for a range of reasons, the key ones being lack of time and resources, per the usual for such projects, the encoded texts were processed through relational graphing software to determine the most efficient layout, and by that I mean with as little crossing of edges as possible, which mapped the data in an abstract form rather than trying to shoehorn and pin the data down to a concrete map. Next slide, please. Thank you. Our visualizations represented literary spatiality topologically, which allowed us to undertake the comparison of, for example, suggestion versus fabular forms, which create very, very different maps. The image we have here is of Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and highlights wonderfully the distinction between these two forms. The fabular form, on the left, is a narrative order. It's the chronological order of the narrative, of the overall tale, whereas the sujet model represents the setting as it is experienced point by point. So the narrative order is how the reader engages with it. Starts at point A, moves to B, moves to C, moves to D, moves to E, whereas the suggestion form is, well, the overall story begins at this point, and then this, and so it begins at point D, and then point B happens, then A, then C, then F, G, H. So it's absolutely. So these are very different forms, showcasing very different priorities. And it is this very basic literary stylometry that starts to provide a little bit more of a quantitative backbone, allowing us to examine the elements of construction, and that's formed our analytic basis. So this was all built on a solid critical background formed from De Certo's tour model, and followed Ljungberg's recent work on the diagrammatic functionality of maps. So we had a solid critical basis, and we had yeah, absolutely. So we have a single article that briefly outlines our digital methodology, our analytic process, and our rationale currently available alongside the documentation for our digital toolset on the website, but we do have a paired set of articles due for imminent publication in Cartographica, which really hammers home the critical value of our mapping process. But, as you may have spotted, the namescape for this text is non-existent. There are spaces, oh yes, but no places. And just to establish what I mean when I use those terms, and I do recognise that 50 scholars will likely give 50 different answers when it comes to the minutiae of this distinction, but I like to keep things simple and interpret places as named entities and spaces as those that are unnamed. So please bear with me that is how I'm going to be using place. It's going to be a named point. Now, how could any of those literary mapping projects mentioned earlier cope with such a data set? One could superimpose this very form, well, either of these forms, over the Atlantic, but what would that achieve? What would that show in and of itself? Nothing. The project identified the chronotopic forms as key interpretative elements to the spatial construction, and it quickly became readily apparent that how a narrative moved between spaces was just as important a critical component as the type of space employed. Next slide, please. Thank you. Here is another chronotopic map. Yes, this is a bit of an eyeful, and it's a complete narrative of Oliver Twist as interpreted by Dr. Becca Hutchin, and what a mess. But it's not without its value, for even in this en masse form, we can see which spaces interconnect between two or more of the main active locations, but it does require quite a bit of patience. It does require a lot of work to get into it and to be able to start understanding the spatiality, reading the spatiality from that. But if we were to divide a text into constituent chapters, for example, and assess each as part of a greater whole, we can start to explore how names are employed across a work so as to effectively build a precisely crafted setting that corresponds directly with the narrative as it is presented. I've been in a fortunate enough position to be able to continue tinkering with the underlying model, and since the project's conclusion, I've been working on a series of adaptations that work solely with the namescape of a text. So cutting out the chronotopic form underpinning spaces, which is easy enough to add back in at later points, but just breaking it down to its bare bone essentials for this approach and just using it to adapting it for namescape work. And so I now finally progress into discussing my original work, and thank you for bearing with me through this background. And so although it is derived from work on chronotopic cartographies, it is very much a series of iterations and developments that do not directly correspond one for one with the maps created and published for that project. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So to illustrate the considerations that need to be taken into account when working with the dataset for literary namescape, I would like to turn to Dracula's opening chapter, as this has been an exemplar of mine when discussing the limits, inefficiencies and issues of parsing fiction with conventional NER techniques since my very earliest postgrad work. Next slide, please. Thank you. There are 48 name tokens that appear in this order. In and of itself, this presents a rather complex geographic picture that jumps around the world quite drastically. No? We'll come back to that in a second. Next slide, please. Thank you. I should note that that dataset is the result of a manual sweep, as even the most recent version of W Matrix, for example, struggles to identify the majority of these named points, picking up ostensibly a dozen of the 27 discrete tokens. And that is at the high end of the tagging processes I have tried. But that's a whole other discussion of bulk versus accuracy. And whilst you might be thinking, blimey, James, fancy presenting at the Digital Scholarship Lab and downplaying automated extraction techniques, but I promise there is a method to this. And I will venture some ideas on the value of complementary semantic tagging in a bit. Anyways, howsoever we may get the data, we have this series of valid entries in this order. So how could it be mapped? How would it be mapped? How should it be mapped? Next slide, please. Adding in a little bit of context to each of those occurrences, each of those individual tokens, we start to get a clearer picture of how these named entities are being employed in this narrative, how they are experienced. And as we can see, there starts to be a little bit of a divide. So taking the namescape of 48 tokens solely in the order the entities appear, creates a rather confusing jumble that leaps about the world with no logical progression, comparative point, or referential purpose. Incorporating a brief contextualizing role through the relation allows for a more logical reconstruction of this onymic utilization of how these names appear, how they function, particularly in showing those places that serve as key points on the journey, those that branch off the key points as descriptive asides, and those that serve in more figurative roles. Next slide, please. Thank you. The format of the text is a series of letters, which is tricky which presents a whole other array of difficulties of working with, but we have discrete steps providing quite unified. Well, it provides discrete chunks of text that recounts the previous step of the character's journey. So we move forward, and then we get an account of what's come before to that point. Letterheads and such components are easy enough to compensate for, but what about recollections and memories, intended and possible destinations, musings on alternate paths, and metaphors? That is one of the trickiest utilizations of names that one likely has to deal with. One of the lines I most enjoy working with to test parsing platforms is, "It seems to me that the further east you go, the more unpunctual are the trains. What ought they be in China?" Given the range of name points that feature in this chapter, describing the journey up to this point, without the narrative context, the appearance of that country's name could be a valid token of an earlier journey or a possible intended destination. Rather than provide a disparate point of reference from the rest of the namescape or be overlooked in a semantic analysis as a consequence of this role, such a detail can be easily provided through the use of a representational topological edge. And we can see a huge variation in the scale of reference from geocultural concepts and continents to countries. So we have the East and the West. We have countries, France and Germany. We've got topography. We've got mountains, Istinsjek, God's seat, all the way down to individual buildings. So if you could go back a slide, please. Thank you. So this namescape presents a wonderful exemplar for the twisty-turniness, which is my technical term of particular choice. It's a nice example of non-linear narratives and of the linguistic capacity of names. They can be applied in so many different ways to create a very carefully cultivated experience. And returning to my earlier point, they should not be treated as equally significant as a result. Can we move forward, please? Thank you. Sorry, back one. Yeah, back, thank you. So indeed, the work of Gritter et al. Provide evidence of a pretty near even split, 53 to 47%, if I recall, in the base role of names across 200 news articles. So it's 53% literal versus 47% figurative use. And that such a proportional split can be found in non-fictional sources provides justification alone for the need for greater consideration of onymic function. Their focus is on identifying proper names in use as embedded descriptive modifiers, demonyms or metonymy, such as Britain-based, Turkey fired on, and so forth, and other related applications. But my conceptual proposal for representing literary namescapes parallels their work in many key ways, with the two most important aspects being to capture in a namescape is whether a named place is actively encountered in the course of a narrative or passively referenced. So that's the first point. Is it active or passive? Is the reader, through a character, actually at a point, or is it or is a name point mentioned in some other experience in some other degree, and what relation is evidenced through textual description. So how is the name point, whether it is, how is the next name point? Yeah, so we've got active versus passive. Let's just keep that. I'll just try and keep it simple for the moment. Anyway, hint, this is one point where the use of semantic tagging starts to come in handy. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this table presents the types of relation and connection that I think succinctly captures the range of relations that is useful for the representation of a narrative's namescape. And just to make it a little easier to read, I have followed the Chronotopic Cartography's coloration scheme, which was designed with visual accessibility in mind for on-screen viewing. We have the double line purple edges, which denote physical proximity and movement and transition. We have the single line orange, which shows imagined states and memories which occurred outside of the narrative, and the dotted blue references, which show active distortions in spatial representations, such as possible futures, definite pasts, as actively encountered within a narrative, and present uncertainty. And the white ones, which have no standardized shape, they are for the MISC uses, which you always need. These options were settled on as they offer a good balance of categorical distinction whilst not being too unwieldy, not being too specific, which is always a fine line when developing a classificatory scheme. And don't worry, I will keep a version of these tables handy for reference when we come to it, when we need them. Anyway, long story short, with my adapted methodology, next slide please, this is a topological rendition of the namescape that I think is most representationally efficient. Next slide please. Thank you. So, and let's just see this in coloured form. I submit to you all that this depiction is more useful than a concrete rendition overlaid of a real-world map, as for the critical spatial engagement, it does not matter the exact Cartesian direction or distance between any two named points. It doesn't matter where Bistritz is in relation to Munich, or London is in relation to Castle Dracula, for example. But what's more important is how they connect, where they are found within an efficiently generated layout of the namescape. This, I think, provides greater scope for spatial analysis beyond the superficial semantics, and it frees any analysis from working just to the concrete. So it allows us to look to reprioritize the spatiality of a namescape, to look at what aspects are most important for that individual space, textual space. So now we can get right down into the structural roles of literary names. I'll keep these critical observations short and sweet. The efficiency of graph modeling software typically minimizes the number of edge and the connections, the relational lines, crossovers, which provides a crucial basis underpinning this form of namescape mapping. The most referenced active locations, which is where the narrative action occurs, so that is where the central character, the reader, is placed, where they are experiencing the narrative world from, clearly form the heart of this map. So we've got with Bukovina, the Borgo Pass, Bistritz, and the Carpathians, which corresponds with the four active locations from which the reader experiences the character's travels firsthand, alongside a key passive referential, Castle Dracula. The castle provides the experientially defining destination which frames this setting. The fuzzy state distortion defining edges, the blue dotted lines, here connect spaces that serve as a projected endpoint of a journey, but that the character does not complete. We've got Bukovina, so that's where he is recommended to, that's just where he thinks he's going to go. We have a recollection of a previous encounter in Bistritz, and the point of uncertainty where the character and reader pass into an unknown space, an unmappable space, that which is Castle Dracula, embedded between these key. So Castle Dracula is embedded within key, locatable within real space reference. We know where the Borgo Pass is. We know where Bucovino was. We know where the Carpathians are, but we cannot say with any certainty that this exact point was Castle Dracula. And that's a whole debate into itself with Castle Bram. If you search for Castle Dracula just in Google, it's so easy to conflate the two, even though they're not. And that's part of the issue with working with GIS topographical maps, in my opinion. Anyway, the Borgo Pass serves as the liminal point in which the two possible future states are provided, and is the point at which the narrative enters a point of no return for the central character. This is indicated by the direct connection to the zoomed out delineation of the Carpathians, as the route taken is deliberately obscured and subsequent ambiguous connection, and hence the ambiguous connection to the castle. The active route followed across the narrative, the double-lined purple connections, is readily observable and is distinct from the prior intended locations on the journey. So the orange and the unrealized, which is the blue. Together, these three different colours create a striking representation of this namescape's true spatial construction, as the character literally spirals into the unknown and crosses into an unmappable domain. For what reason is the London containing loop separated from that which contains France and Germany, for example, despite the logical temporal progression from one to the next? We can infer that the character must have started in London, must then have moved on to France, then on to Germany, then on to Budapest, so forth, but they do not appear chronologically in the text, as the former contextually serves, albeit in a remembered state, as a description of a fact-finding interlude, rather than as the main route to Klausenberg, which is the current active locale at this point in the narrative. These entries should be kept separate, proximate, but distinct, exactly as they are with this generative model. So that's a topological reframe of the namescape, and a very quick example of interpreting the structural layout generated from how the space is directly represented in the text. Hopefully you find it interesting and visually appealing, but you might be wondering, okay, that's all well and good, but how is that going to reinvent the investigation of literary onomastics? It's still just working on an isolate, a single chapter of a single text. So let's bring in some other generations, such as, slide please. Can you tell what this namescape is? Is taken from just by looking at it? Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. Or, next please. This is a section of Lovecraft County, specifically from the Dunwich Horror. And next slide please. Thank you. The opening from Sir Terry Pratchett's Discworld text, The Truth, one of my favourites of his. Next slide please. Thank you. Now there's a good reason I have these four maps here together, because principally no one in their right mind would even think of attempting a comparison between them in any way, shape or form. Crucially, each of these maps represents a very different form of literary space. Dracula starts in the real world before transitioning into an unknown space. Fear and Loathing is set entirely within the real. Lovecraft County is a seamless integration of the real and the fantastic, whilst Discworld is entirely fictional with no correspondence to the real world whatsoever. I said before that efficiency modelling provided the crucial basis for creating such maps, and that is because they are statistically consistent and generated entirely from the dataset with no manual intervention. They are as neutral a representation of a namescape as is possible. And so, such topological modelling presents an ideal platform for directly comparing these spatial builds. Building on the brief analysis I provided for Dracula earlier, we can start to address a whole suite of questions that deftly blend qualitative semantic interpretation with the quantitative spine, providing the exact sort of critical utility that was advocated by Cavill earlier. Next slide, please. Thank you. No matter how disparate the sources might otherwise be, it is the reduction of the spatial build to their core referential interconnections that ultimately, I would argue, informs the experience of a setting, providing a logical basis for this bottom-up relational approach. On this slide, we see the underlying regularized topological network models, which will be featured in any graph, which themselves provide a solid interpretational basis for connecting or comparing different narrative styles. What I see here are 8 very different forms of spatial structure that ties in very closely, each of which ties in very closely with distinct narrative forms, and every textual namescape will comprise one, or probably more, of these. We can delve into the interpretation of these layouts in order to really engage with the form and functionality of a text's presented spatial relations and interplay at a structural level. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, these queries listed are but a very small sampling of the stylometric analysis that can be undertaken, that can be conducted on namescapes represented in such a consistent, regularized manner. The 3 that I personally find most useful and interesting as they relate to emotional perception and personal place attachment, which is what I'm really interested in, for example, what sort of spaces are referred to with more than one name, and are they central points, the most connected or the most remote? Are they passively referenced more than actively experienced? What sort of spaces trigger a shift to a different name form? So when does by what name is a place first encountered, and if it shifts, when does it shift? Why does it shift? How does it shift? From where does it shift? Second question I like is, to what degree do alternate names take on the determinative form? If so, which form is preferred throughout the narrative, and at what point does a transition from the first form occur? Again, that ties in very closely with that first query I like. And thirdly, does a text have a preference for starting out at key points before zooming out and exploring the surrounding entities, or do they circle in, very much like Dracula, where you start off externally and you move in? But there are so many other interpretive queries that can be reconsidered through this form of topological mapping. Structural considerations not only provide a solid bridge between very different forms of literature, but they highlight the extent to which specific name forms guide a reader's experience, the emotional direction and the associative qualities. Traditional literary onomastic studies do not, indeed cannot, engage with any of these points, because individual semantic value has been necessarily prioritized over these broader structural considerations. And that is what my topological approach to namescapes offers, a whole new investigative angle built on this quantitative core from only 2 pieces of metadata. Is a name active or passive at this point in the text, and how does it relate to the last active entity? Next slide, please. We've only got. I'm running a little bit over time. I'm going to gloss over this. I'm going to gloss over this analysis just to get to my concluding remarks, so I can take some questions, because I'd love to hear any comments or thoughts you might have. So if you can skip to the next slide, please, and the next slide again. Thank you. So I think the capacity to render such dynamic representations allow for these topological patterns to form the basis of a structural-led mode of analysis that can show changes in spatial priorities, that can show how changes in spatial priorities occur across a narrative, or as a complete set, by bringing in very different texts which might otherwise be incompatible, could not be directly comparable. The particular value of the stylometric inquiries I shared earlier is that they not only offer an entirely new angle for looking at how names are employed to build settings, set scenes, and direct a reader's placement and engagement with a literary world, with a narrative, but they also provide a neutral means of spatial codification upon which more traditional semantic-led comparisons can then be undertaken. Such enrichment and expansion of traditional scopes to bring in new approaches that challenge and build on traditional conventions is exactly what digital scholarship in the humanities, to my mind, is all about. I hope that made sense to everyone. Thank you. If we've got time, we can go back and we can revisit the 2 chapters of Fear and Loathing, which I had to skip over, but I am mindful of the time that we've got left. So
thank you so much, James. I mean, I don't know about anyone else, if you prefer to go back first, or we could do a couple of questions first and then go back if you want. It's up to you.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, I was just going to say, first of all, thank you so much for your presentation. It's really, really interesting. Honestly, every time I see you talk about your research, you do it in such a fantastic way. Like it's a very complex idea, but you're always the way you explain it is fantastic.
Oh, it's very kind. Thank you, Catherine. I don't feel like it at the moment, but
no. I mean, and I do completely agree that the approach that you take and the result that you have at the end definitely seems to have a lot more usefulness, like utility for research purposes, or than having it and trying to place these places, locate these places on a map, in a cartographic sense. So, did anyone have any questions at the moment? I could maybe ask one while we're waiting, unless someone has an immediate one. I was just going to. Oh, Paul, go ahead.
No, you go for it. You had a minute.
Okay. I was just going to ask about, you mentioned how it doesn't take into account the distance between places, and I was just wondering if you had thoughts about maybe certain narratives where distance between places is maybe important. I'm thinking about, I don't know, like narratives where they're on a journey, like Lord of the Rings, these kind of fantasy, we start at point A, you end up at point Z, and some parts of the journey are obviously quite quick and others are more drawn out. So do you have thoughts on, I don't know, incorporating that kind of aspect?
Oh, absolutely. If you go back 2 slides, please. Yeah, I think. Yes, thank you. So this is one where I'm sat. This shows a little bit of where I'm trying to play about with this a little bit, with the use of qualitative spatial expressions. The opening lines of Fear and Loathing is, "We were somewhere around Barstow, on the edge of the desert, where the drugs began to take hold," which I absolutely love. But that sort of typifies why I'm so against topographical mapping, because it's not Barstow. It's somewhere around. There's a degree of obscuration there. So I think that does have to be captured. So by trying to capture these locative expressions somewhere around and integrating them in this manner, I do think that could tie into the length of the edges as they are applied. Again, I just work with very basic some very basic Gephi commands, where I'm just trying to create as efficient a map as possible within a set spatial parameters, just basically on my screen what looks neat. But there's so much that could be done with that. But I think barring a lot of that would require manual intervention, which I'm trying to. But in trying to automate it, I do think working with these sorts of expressions is more useful for integrating this sort of map. So we've got the Polo Lounge as well, the patio section of the Beverly Heights Hotel. So that's a location that's within a location that's also within another named location. Each of those is useful, but and I think it's important. I think it's useful to capture those to show that sort of scaling in. Zooming in.
Absolutely. Yeah, I certainly wouldn't describe it as basic. Like, even I don't know what Gephi commands you're using, but certainly it doesn't need to be. You don't want to be overcomplicating it, because the result is like a clean, understandable product.
Absolutely.
Paul, did you want to go ahead?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm interpreting what you're saying correctly, but you're saying these are produced automatically from the text, so you're trying to remove any subjectivity from what you're doing. But are you doing that? You're doing it by hand, but automatically, as in you'll read it and just write what you're saying, rather than it being done automatically by computer?
That's what I've been doing so far, just by dint of because I have very little resources. I'm working by myself, and this is part-time research with my own personal interests. But I do think that there is a way. I do think that this can be automated. I've been playing about with some semantic taggers to identify these qualitative spatial expressions. So going through and identifying the place names is one thing. That's a challenge unto itself. Trying to work out what's active and what's passive, that does require a human reading. It's very difficult for a machine to pass that sort of engagement at that level. But again, it's something that could be built on. It's something that Dave, Bevan, and I were looking into at the way back at the start of 2020. But that just got interrupted, and then there was all sorts of timesheet mishaps, and then he had used up all his time that he could allocate, and
cool. Thanks. I'd like to follow up with you about semantic tagging at some point, Alex.
Absolutely.
Did you want to come in, Alex? Not sure if.
I think both of my points have sort of been answered already. One was about locations within locations and whether it's possible to show those on the map as perhaps sort of smaller blobs within larger blobs, and how that would work with the existing sort of intelligent way of organizing the locations that you already have. And then the other question was about moving on from sort of natural language processing to artificial intelligence ways of working out whether locations are passive or active. I think both of those questions have been answered. So, sorry, hands down, actually, now.
No, thank you. I take it. I understand exactly where you're coming from. Again, I didn't use blobs within blobs for this sort of thing, because I was just trying to keep everything as neat and easily readable as possible. If you think back to that Oliver Twist map, for example, I mean, that you can't read that without really zooming in and starting moving things about, and again, something I'm trying to avoid. But if you just very briefly, I mean, what I like about this map is opening chapter. At the heart of it is New York, which is a metaphor for the New York office, because they're what's setting everything in motion. That's why he's going to Las Vegas. But if you move to the next slide, please, Catherine. Thank you. This was the opening chapter of part 2, and which takes on a very different form. But the heart of this one, what's at the very heart, the very centre of this image, is an imagined journey from to LA, and going through Death Valley, Interstate 13, through Baker, and that's what he's imagining. That's what he wants the police to think. That's what he's so desperate to get out of there, because he hates it. That's when the fear and loathing starts to set in. But his actual route goes back, so Las Vegas is shifted over to the side, and New York doesn't feature at all in this. So it just shows how the namescape changes, and the spatial priorities, what's at the very heart of the matter, does change from chapter to chapter, which is something that's very difficult to track via conventional. If you just have a list of these are all the named entities, you can't quite get a sense of what's at the heart, what's lying at the outset. How do these? You might get a space that's connected to so many other points, because it's always referred back to. But how do you? But yes, it's just trying to capture and convey that information visually and that's easy to comprehend and decode.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I absolutely love these these charts. Some of my favourite books as well you've chosen here. I really like the idea as well of maybe taking it to in an additional dimension and possibly animating it.
Yes. Yes.
You can see how the locations change and come into play and interplay with each other over time, and how that changes from chapter to chapter and within the chapter.
Absolutely, I have.
It'd be a really lot of work if you were doing it yourself, but if you were able to employ that AI, that's the sort of thing that could be done.
I have been in conversation with Professor Andrew Richardson, who started developing some of these very basic animated tool sets for chronotopic cartographies work. Absolutely fantastic, but they were so. But we didn't have too much of it. We couldn't buy too much of his time, so it was tailored towards to 3 very specific texts and very specific contexts. But that sort of thing. I'll send a link out to you afterwards if you're interested in seeing some of the things he developed as a co-investigator. But yes, long story short, I'm mumbling my way through here, but yes, that is something that I really do want to do, and I think that making it as visually accessible as possible and user-friendly as possible is very important, and could be good fun.
This should always be a key part as well, no? That it should be fun. That's a key part. Does anyone else have any other questions? We're kind of coming towards the end of the time, or did you want to say anything more about these last 2 slides, James?
No, I think I just very briefly went over it. It was mainly the heart, so how it shifts from New York to and Vegas and LA shift about. It's all about the spatial priorities as expressed through the namescape of these separate chapters.
I just had one thing pop back into my head when you were talking about New York. I think, are you dealing with metonyms as well? So if somebody says Washington, that could be the American government.
Absolutely. That's why for my categorization, I treated everything that was a non-literal use as a metaphor. But metonymy is the most prominent use of place names, and not to refer to something other than place.
Yeah. Okay.
Because on this one, I think we've got no, it was on the earlier one. No, we've got Saigon there, where they refer to Saigon shades, and on this one we've got Acapulco, which is Acapulco shirts.
Yeah.
So again, it's a valid place name, but out of place in this context, but still worthy of making note of, because the fact that this place name is used to refer to an object that's not a place is still interesting in and of itself.
Yeah, and many NER systems in NLP just don't pick that up properly.
That's the problem of literature. Yeah, it's meant to be. It's language used very creatively in. Yeah.
Yeah, it also occurs widely in newspapers as well, and doesn't get picked up there either.
Absolutely. I mean that article by M. Gritter and his colleagues. I mean that is it's a really interesting read, and if you're interested, I do recommend it.
Thanks.
Thanks, Paul.
Okay, so I think unless anyone else has any final questions, now is the time. Okay. Well then, thank you so much, James. That was absolutely fantastic, really, really interesting. I should also thank your surprise guest host. Thank you to your cat for making an appearance.
Sorry about that. I don't know how she managed to open that door.
That's more than welcome. And thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for your questions. We'll be back again in the new year with the Digital Humanities Hangouts, but that's it for this term. So have a nice rest of the term and then the holidays. We'll see you next year.
Thank you for taking the time, everyone.